Hey everyone, welcome to Bitcoin Banter. I appreciate you being here. I've got a special guest today, Mitchell Askew from Blockware. And Mitchell, thank you so much for coming on the show. The rest of the team's in Prague right now. They're a little tied up, so I'm glad we can have this conversation.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on, Michael. I was on your podcast about a month or two ago and I enjoyed it. So I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. We've got a lot of news this week, dude. This is usually this would be recorded later in the week and shared on Saturday. We're doing it a bit earlier, and there's already a lot to cover. So let's jump right in here. I'm going to share my screen if I can. And we're going to start with just saw this and I couldn't help but think this is something we ought to be discussing. So this is 27% of Americans are skipping meals due to high food prices. 18% are considering food stamps. 21% feeling ashamed of not affording groceries. Dude, this is crazy. And we're going to get to CPI here in a minute because there was a recent print. Man, give me your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, to me, the first thing that comes to mind is this is an example of shrinkflation, a lower quality of living that doesn't manifest itself in the quote unquote official inflation data, right?
Mhm.
And when Americans are skipping meals, obviously that's not going to show up in the CPI. In fact, it's going to make CPI look lower because they're not bidding on goods, so prices aren't going up, but their quality of life is going lower, and it's because of the debasement of the currency, right? So they can't afford as many groceries with their current salary because the price of groceries are going up. So that's definitely the first thing that comes to mind. Other examples of shrinkflation would be, a 24 pack of toilet paper used to cost whatever, $20. Now $20 gets you a 12 pack of toilet paper. And in the CPI basket, oh, you're still buying toilet paper, right? And so it doesn't necessarily show up. Or you were buying grass-fed steak and now you're buying, ground beef. Or maybe after that you buy uh even lower quality like fake meat, right? And so they can kind of alter the goods that are in the CPI basket to make inflation not seem as bad as it is. And this is just another representation of that.
Yeah, man, that's a good point because my initial thought was just this is sad and yeah, to sort of make light of it, I said who needs Ozempic when you've got inflation? I mean, people like the fact that people are literally skipping meals because of food costs, but like this is I think where like I've talked to some of my friends who are financial advisors and they're like, yeah, but most people don't really change their buying habits with inflation, and it's like maybe you're lucky enough to work with like an upper middle class cohort that can afford it. They've got assets to match inflation, but like this is the reality I think for a lot of people that just gets totally missed by your average person who has benefited from inflation for the last 30, 50 years. So uh it's a crazy thing to imagine in the United States, but this is, I mean, this is truly where we've come to. And if it isn't affecting you, understand it affects a lot of other people, is kind of what I would say to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure your financial advisor friend, no offense to him, probably has a little bit of bias from the crowds he's hanging around with because inflation disproportionately affects the bottom 50% of Americans that don't own any assets. If you own hard assets since 2020 when the currency got debased, you're actually probably better off because everything went up. But if all your net worth is tied up in cash and you haven't been able to increase your income, then you are doing far worse and your buying habits they're going to have to change, right? Because prices are going up, incomes mostly stay the same. So there's no way for buying habits to not.
100%. Couldn't agree more. Okay, let's talk about inflation. So this was the CPI print this week, up 3.3 year over year, 0% month over month. I like James Lavish's comment. He said, so the takeaway is prices are still rising. Inflation seems stuck at 3%. And by the way, 3% versus 2%, which is the target, which is a silly target to steal from us at 2%, is a big difference. I mean, it sounds negligible, but that's 50% over what they're targeting.
Yeah.
And he said the White House will be insufferable about the 0%, which is classic politics.
Yeah. Well, I think, and I haven't dug too deep into the granularity of the CPI print, but I did see where they were releasing oil and gas from the stockpile to get gasoline prices down. So that may have had an effect on why month over month was 0%. But you're right. I mean, 2% to 3%, it's actually a 50% increase in the target rate there. And we haven't seen a sub 3% CPI print and since I want to say like 2021 at this point. It's been a long time. And we've kind of reached this regime where higher inflation has been normalized. And keep in mind, this is CPI, mind you, right? This is the lowest bar measure of inflation. Because really, if you measure the change in prices of goods people actually buy instead of the goods that are in the CPI basket, it's going to be much higher, right? If you want a nice house, if you want to drive your car a lot, if you want to eat good food, your hurdle rate's going to be a lot higher than 3.3%. But let's take the 3.3% at face value, right? Using the rule of 72, you're still going to lose half your purchasing power in just 21 years, right? So you and I, similar age, right? We're in our 20s. So 40 years from now, your purchasing power of anything you save now is going to get cut in half twice, right? So one fourth the purchasing power by the time we're ready to retire. And that's just using this low bar measure of inflation. So 3.3%, it sounds low relative to, where we were at in 2021 and 2022, but that is still, prices are rising and it's dollar debasement.
Yeah, and in spite of that, I'll jump to the next one. I'm going to skip the petrodollar. We'll get to that in a second. Elizabeth Warren. So first of all, I thought the Federal Reserve was supposed to be totally independent, but
Yeah.
she wrote a letter asking them to cut rates effectively. So as though inflation wasn't high enough and affecting enough people, they're wanting to start seeing rate cuts, which I think most people believe is inevitable at some point in time. But I did want to hear your thoughts. Uh, is this, do you think, a political move in light of the upcoming election? Is this to keep the economy humming, or because obviously the downstream effects of a print or the lowering of interest rates, it's delayed, right? Like there's a lag on when that starts to hit in the form of higher inflation. What are your thoughts here?
It's interesting because I would think the wiser move as sort of the incumbent politicians or political party going into the election, but to actually be to keep rates paused, right? Because when you start to lower them, you're conceding, hey, the economy is contracting, things are looking bad, or entering a recession. So I would think it would be more strategic for them to keep rates elevated. But the kind of net effect of liquidity when lowering rates at this point, it's almost moot, right? Because we've seen global liquidity increase on a year over year basis. And also, we've seen the M2 money supply increase on a year over year basis, right? And that's because we've seen all sorts of like sneaky liquidity injections besides having low interest rates. So we had the BTFP program in 2023. We had the recent kind of bailout of the Central Bank of Japan that nobody's really talked about. And then we have these massive government deficits, right? And so when rates are high, the deficits are growing because the interest expense is so high. So net liquidity is going to continue to rise even if rates remain elevated. So the kind of discussion around, where should the Fed put the Fed funds rate at this point, I think it's almost a distraction because monetary debasement is inevitable whether rates are high or low at this point.
Yeah, I kind of wonder though if most people, like I think about my world, most people that I know and love and care about and spend time with are completely unaware that that letter was sent. They have no idea. They know interest rates have been on the rise, and that's about it. And it sort of makes me wonder if, from a voting perspective, if she's unconcerned about people fearing a recession because of a letter she sent, because most people just aren't paying attention to that news. But she views it as a means of, yeah, I don't even know. It just it seems like it could be an attractive, people who can't afford a home right now but have been looking, they get a bit of a bargain on their next house relative to where we are today, something like that. So I feel like I've heard so many mixed signals on what the Fed's likely to do. Eventually, I think rates have to come down. It's the higher rates are unsustainable, and they're only working to some degree anyway. Again, back to our last, we're still at 3.3% year over year, and it's been doing that for a long time. So I'll be curious to see. Well, first of
Yeah.
all, if the Fed begins to pivot under political pressure, which would be a bad reason to pivot, but second, just what they're going to do for the remainder of the year. We'll have to keep our eyes open for that. So dude, this is
Yeah. Well,
something. Oh yeah, go on.
if they
No, go on.
pivot before CPI gets down to yeah, I think we might have to cut this out. There's a little bit of a delay, but if they pivot before 3%, sorry, if they pivot before inflation gets back down to 2%, then they're basically conceding that we're in a regime of higher inflation. So I don't know that that's necessarily something Powell wants to do to in terms of like how history will will look back on as legacy. So
Mm,
it'll be interesting to see. And you did bring up a good point that obviously the Fed's a political entity, no matter how much they try to convince us that they're not, because the Fed chairman's appointed by the president, and then you have a senator sending a letter saying, "Hey, you need to dictate monetary policy this way."
for sure. So this was something I had this was not on my radar at all, but the 50-year petrodollar system is over. I guess the agreement that Saudi Arabia had with the United States to only accept payment for oil in dollars is done as of Sunday, June 9th. Uh, to me, so again, I'm not like a macro finance guy. I mean, my initial thought on this is it obviously, as the dollar continues to become less appealing on a global stage, it seems to me like this opens the door. I mean, obviously, it opens the door for them to accept in multiple currencies, including euros, yen, yuan, like a lot of options. Oh, digital currencies like Bitcoin may be considered. That might be a smart move for them. Um, but like when we froze Russian assets and we sort of weaponized the dollar, which we've done, throughout time, it seems to me like the motivation to begin moving away from dollars has increased at a time where it's now permissible, I guess. What is your take on that?
Yeah, well, it's definitely not bullish dollars, that's for sure. I don't know how much trade will actually shift into other currencies. That's something, we'll have to see with time. But Saudi Arabia, their number one trade partner at the moment is China. And it's definitely not in China's interest to hold more dollars than they need to, because we saw, China's obviously kind of adversarial with the United States, and so is Russia. And regardless of your opinions on the Russia Ukraine situation, we saw the US freeze Russia's dollar assets, right? And so China doesn't want to make themselves vulnerable in the same way. So they're going to want to hold as few dollars as possible. And, we've seen kind of a, just a overall decrease in demand for dollars globally, and definitely with U.S. Treasuries, right? And China's not; they're the number one holder of U.S. Treasuries at the moment, but they've been a net seller of Treasuries, as far as I understand, over the last few years. And Japan is second, and we saw earlier this year where the United States didn't want them selling their Treasuries either. So it's not bullish for dollars. How bearish it is could be anybody's guess. I know some people kind of subscribe to the dollar milkshake theory that all the other fiat currencies will go away first and the dollar will survive for a little bit longer. I'm not a foreign currency expert myself, but this definitely doesn't seem bullish for dollars, and it's potentially bullish for Bitcoin, right? Because we know how Bitcoin is super integrated into the energy markets, or at least it should be, right? It's the most fungible global commodity. It really represents the opportunity cost of energy production, right? Because how much Bitcoin could you mine with the energy you're producing? It's very a tangible, quantifiable opportunity cost there. So at some point, I think we will see Saudi Arabia definitely adopt Bitcoin, just because of the correlation and the way the Bitcoin mining and energy markets just fit like a glove.
Yeah. It seems like this might be. I'm curious if this will be like a turning point. We talk about de-dollarization, and I think a lot of Bitcoiners get excited about the notion that the world's going to move away from dollars into Bitcoin, and I think that's obviously coming at some point. Today, though, there is a massive amount of dollar denominated debt. Like there are a lot of reasons that people outside of the United States still need dollars, and by my understanding, will still need dollars for years, decades to come potentially. But I wonder if we'll look back on this as like this sort of quiet inflection point that most people didn't, most people again in the world didn't even realize was going on if you're not paying attention to these markets. And we'll look back and say that was when the dollar it began to die in 1971, and like this was like an acceleration point for us.
Yeah, I think that's a great take, and it is interesting that this, because this is big news, right? But it's not really leaving the traditional finance or Bitcoin circles, right? It's not sort of hitting mainstream normie land. And the media is very deliberate with the stories they choose and the stories they don't, right? And so the fact that they don't want to draw attention to this is very telling.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's get on to some Bitcoin stuff here. So we've got, I need to move you out of my way here. I gotta get to my tabs. Let's see. All righty. So this is some big news. So we've got Swan sponsoring Tucker Carlson. on his live tour. I think he's going to, what do you say, 12 or 15 cities around the United States. Um, I mean, I think Tucker Carlson, my impression, I've never like followed or watched in any sort of religious way. I've seen some clips and I think he has some good interviews. It seems to me though, he is beginning to take on a lot of conversations with very important figures and in some at times controversial figures. He talked to Vladimir Putin, Representative Thomas Massey, who I think is probably one of the sort of torchbearers for more of a freedom libertarian branch of Congress, to the extent maybe he's alone with Ron Paul or something, or Rand Paul. But this feels like big news. The fact that Tucker Carlson would take on a Bitcoin company, any crypto company, much less a Bitcoin only company, as one of the core sponsors, it seems telling. And I'm wondering what this means for the industry moving forward.
Yeah, well, we'll start with the fact that this is a Bitcoin only company, which I think is huge, right? Because I'm sure Coinbase could have cut just as big of a check, or Kraken or Gemini, right? But from what Swan was saying, Tucker was looking specifically for a Bitcoin only company, which is great, right? Because Bitcoin and crypto, they're not the same thing. And so, quote unquote, everything other than Bitcoin, it still left a bad taste in people's mouth from FTX. And I know Tucker was all over that story at the time, specifically because I'm sure FTX, or Sam Bankman-Fried, was donating to Democrat politicians. I'm sure Tucker didn't like that. And as far as Tucker goes, he's the biggest name in right wing media at the moment. I think hands down. I personally, I don't listen to his show too often, right? I did listen to him with Thomas Massey because that's great. I mean, Thomas Massey, he put out the bill to in the Fed, right? That guy's a beast. And so Tucker being the biggest figure in right wing media, I mean, his interview with Putin, I'm sure it got tens of millions of views. His show has been X exclusive, right? So he definitely represents this sort of like independent journalism, a shift away from traditional incumbent systems. And he's blown up since he left Fox News, right? He's blown up on Twitter. He's massive. And so going into the election year, right, this live tour events taking place throughout September and October is going to be big. And Bitcoin is right there at the center of it all, in sort of this mainstream political discourse. And I wrote a book, The Conservative Case for Bitcoin. When I started writing this last year, I didn't expect, Bitcoin and to be so like at the forefront of the political discussion this year. I knew it would be a topic, but it's really kind of becoming the key topic. And I know that's sort of the next item we have on the agenda to discuss is Trump's pro Bitcoin position. It's just Bitcoin is now like, because if you look at it this way, right, a politician has nothing to gain at the margin from being anti-Bitcoin. They're not going to gain any support by being anti-Bitcoin that they otherwise wouldn't have already had. But you can gain a lot of support by being pro-Bitcoin. And we're seeing that already play out. And Bitcoin's very much aligned with the values that Tucker Carlson subscribes to. And, he had Michael Saylor on a show a couple years ago, and he's talked to a lot of people that are really pro-Bitcoin. So I think it's one of those things where he hears Bitcoin enough times, he has enough of these discussions, and eventually at some point it clicked. And we know it legitimately clicked, right? Because he's seeking a Bitcoin only company. If he was seeking a Bitcoin plus crypto, it might be perceived as more of a grift. Maybe he doesn't truly get it, but he definitely gets it if he was going after Bitcoin only specifically.
Yeah, I love it. I think about like I have one of my best friends is a major Trump apologist, and he, in spite of me talking about Bitcoin, bringing it up, mentioning it, he knows I work in Bitcoin, has just never really engaged. I wonder if like a voice that he listens to, like a Tucker, actively being sponsored by and to some extent therefore promoting Bitcoin and a Bitcoin financial services company, if there are there have to be millions of folks like him who it's like been on their radar because of someone in their life or they just hear about it or whatever, and now they're gonna say Tucker's talking about it, and now we'll talk about it in a second, Trump's talking about it. Maybe this is a thing that I need to revisit.
Yeah, I think so. And thankfully, I mean, not to sort of pat Swan on the back too much, but they're one of the best Bitcoin educators in the space, right? They put out
Mhm.
frequently high signal content. Bitcoin only, they really understand, and they're not bogging people down with the other crypto nonsense. So I think having a focused approach on just Bitcoin will be very very good for these people, and especially as sort of the macroeconomic situation continues to deteriorate. Right? Think about all these people, these Americans we talked about at the beginning of the show, who are skipping meals, right? Clearly, they know something's wrong with the economy and the financial system, and Bitcoin provides such a clear path forward that you can't get with fiat, right? Because there's only 21 million, and the government can't seize your Bitcoin. So it's perfect, and especially as sort of the situation America continues to deteriorate economically, I think you're going to see a positive correlation there with Bitcoin adoption.
For sure. It's bullish indeed. All righty. Last item on the agenda here. We have Donald Trump saying that Bitcoin mining may be our last line of defense against a CBDC. We want all the remaining Bitcoin to be made in the USA. He said it like only Donald Trump would and could. Uh, for me, this is so. My impression is that Donald Trump has a handful of people in his ear right now that are sending the right message, and he seems to be talking more Bitcoin and less crypto. Though I think, as a libertarian, I think, do what you want with crypto. I think he's beginning to understand that there's something to Bitcoin. I think he is also a politician and he doesn't fully understand Bitcoin. I think people are quick to give him too much credit because he said the word self-custody and because he's talking about Bitcoin mining. But it's a massive departure, I think, from his previous position. It's a massive departure from anything that anyone on the lefts believe. And I think he even said he'd protect the crypto or the Bitcoin community, someone from Elizabeth Warren and her goons. So there's something, and he said it'll help us to be energy dominant. There's something that's beginning to click, or at the very least, he's being surrounded by people who already get it and can hopefully speak into his policies around this topic. What level of optimism besides this is obviously good for Bitcoin, what level of optimism do you have that a Trump presidency, and I'm not asking you to provide an endorsement or anything like that, but that if Trump were to be the next president, that we would see like some sort of a tangible net benefit besides he's not going to, ban Bitcoin or something like that.
Yeah, so 2 points I would make here. First, and you alluded to this, right? Does Trump really understand Bitcoin or is someone telling him what to say? Probably the latter, but it's telling to where the Bitcoin industry is at in 2024, right? We're big enough and we're well capitalized enough that we're a voter base worth appealing to. If Bitcoin was nothing, if it was, $1 billion asset instead of $1 trillion asset, and it had a fraction of the amount of adoption, we probably wouldn't be seeing this. But Bitcoin is such a big voter base that's pretty much single issue, right? We have all our net worth tied up in Bitcoin. We're going to vote for the pro Bitcoin candidate almost completely ignorant of any other policies. It makes us a voter base worth targeting, which is a good thing. This is how politics work, right? They try to pick as many positions to get certain voter groups so they can win the election. That's how the game works. And so we're seeing that play out. And then as far as the last two words there, energy dominant, all caps, I think that's obviously bullish for Bitcoin, but more specifically, it's bullish for America. Energy is life, right? We've seen energy become demonized mostly from the left over the last few years, trying to hastily and rashly transition to solar and wind, which are just unreliable. They don't produce nearly enough energy to provide all the 21st century luxuries we have, right? I like grocery stores. I like air conditioning. I like driving cars. I like flushing toilets. All these things, you need energy to do that. And to produce enough energy, you need oil and you need gas and you need nuclear. And I think we'll see more of a swing back to those energy sources and leaning into that under a Trump administration, at least at the margin, definitely more so than we would under a left wing administration. And Bitcoin miners can play a huge role in that. They can also play a huge role in wind and solar if that's your jive, right? Because other than government subsidies, without government subsidies, right, those energy sources aren't profitable, but Bitcoin miners can buy up all the surplus energy from those sources. And overall, they just incentivize more production because as an energy company, you know that any surplus of energy that's not bought by the community, you can just mine Bitcoin with it, or a Bitcoin miner operating independently can buy it from you. So we'll see if we lean into this, the Bitcoin miners, like he's saying. And we saw yesterday he took a picture with a bunch of the CEOs from Riot, from CleanSpark, all these big names, these titans in the Bitcoin mining industry. We'll see if he leans into that, if he gets back into the Oval Office. And if he does, we're going to see an increase in energy production, and energy is directly correlated with human life. If you look on a chart. Energy production and life expectancy, they move tit for tat. So I would love to see more energy be produced here in America. And I think Bitcoin mining is what can drive that forward.
Yeah. Okay, so last question for you then. A lot of Bitcoiners have over the last year or so been very excited about RFK Jr. as a presidential candidate, and he's someone who seems to understand Bitcoin better. I think he spoke at the Bitcoin conference last year. Do you think do you think people begin to move like in our community begin to move away from RFK Jr. toward Trump because he's likely to win, or because his pro Bitcoin stance makes him his very firm pro Bitcoin stance at this point in time makes him a more appealing candidate, or do you think that RFK generally for the Bitcoin space is a more appealing candidate?
I would say 2 points. First, they are moving away to Trump because Trump can win, right? Has a libertarian ever won the the presidential election? They're notoriously losers, right? Unfortunately, right? And I align a lot with libertarian ideology. I'm definitely more conservative, but I sympathize with the libertarians. They've picked bad candidates and they've been weak politically. That doesn't mean necessarily their ideas are bad, but yes, they're going to move away towards the winner because we want to win, right? We don't want to lose. And then second, RFK does he is very much like anti-energy, right? And that doesn't necessarily align with Bitcoin miners, right? He may say, pro Bitcoin things from a financial sense and go to these Bitcoin conferences. But he's very much kind of taken the ESG pill. And so that doesn't necessarily align with Bitcoin miners and what we want to see. So his positions do kind of clash with other Bitcoin
Yeah,
positions that are popular in the Bitcoin communities. He's anti-Second Amendment, and a lot of Bitcoiners are pro-Second Amendment. And so I think we'll see a shift away. I think personally, I would love to see Vivek kind of make a run again in 2028. And I think Vivek may be the one who's actually in Trump's ear on a lot of this Bitcoin stuff, because if you listen to him, he gets it, right? He understands Bitcoin in its totality, right? From a financial sense, from a technological sense, and from an energy perspective. So I think he's probably the guy in Trump's ear. And if Trump does win, I would love to see Vivek sort of have a position in his cabinet.
definitely, man. Awesome. Well, hey, this has been a lot of fun. We covered a lot of ground in a half hour. Hey, this isn't a typical podcast, and usually we just sign off. But why don't you give everyone show your book? Why don't you tell everyone where to find you online?
Yeah, I appreciate it. So you can find me on Twitter at Mitchell Hodl, Mitchellhodl, and then I just launched this book, Conservative Case for Bitcoin. I do have a whole chapter breaking down Bitcoin's connection with the energy markets. So something we talked about a lot today. If some of it doesn't make sense to you, then I definitely recommend getting my book and reading that chapter. I appreciate you having me on, Michael. It's been a
Yeah, man,
blast.
definitely check out the book. It's a good one. I got it. I actually have it back here. And then, of course, if you need help with Bitcoin self-custody, reach out to the Bitcoin Way. We're at thebitcoinway.com/podcast. Follow us at the Bitcoin Way _ on X, Twitter, and myself at the other M Jordan. And appreciate everyone joining, and hope you like this episode with our guest Mitchell. Mitchell, thanks again, man.
Yes, sir.
Cheers, everyone.